All right, so let's get started. In full disclosure, for everyone on this call, I do see the irony in a man presenting a conversation about women and investing. So let me set expectations from the start. I'm not here to speak for women. I humbly admit I'm in no position to do that. I'm here to share what the data shows. I'm here to share what the experience I've had over many years has taught me. And I'm here to share the fundamentals that help people make good decisions around growing and managing their wealth. Maybe it's helpful before we jump in to tell a quick story which helped shape how I feel about these things and do this work. So it was many years ago at this point. I was helping my wife manage her father's affairs. We had to meet with um, some experts, attorneys, accountants. He was suffering from Alzheimer's. His health was declining. And so we went to meet these people. One thing you should know about my wife, she is very bright and quite capable and well organized. And so she showed up to these meetings with very intelligent questions that she asked of the people that sat across the table from us. And what we both noticed was when these individuals answered, they answered as though I had asked the questions. And their focus was on me, their attention on me, but she was the one asking the questions. And when we got out of those meetings, I was struck. She had said at the time, it's like they thought these things would be too complex for me to understand. And I was struck in that moment by that as well, and thought to myself, money decisions aren't his or her decisions; they're household decisions. And the job of an advisor is to make important things understandable, to make important decisions possible once people are well enough educated on these principles. So that's the purpose of today's presentation. No jargon, no hype. We're just going to talk about the fundamentals and why these things work through time to help individuals, in particular women, manage their finances and their wealth. Okay, so we'll pause for a brief disclosure here. Very good. Okay, so let's start with some real world headlines, and then we're going to move straight into the overlap between what matters most and what we have control over. So for many women, this is the experience. Women are their income is frequently interrupted. They're either providing care for another, they're leaving the workforce to have children. Sometimes they're caring for the generation that preceded them, sometimes for the generation that followed. 1 in 4 US adults is providing care to somebody else, and 61% of those are female. Women have a higher likelihood of being the sole decision makers in their household, either through divorce or widowhood. In fact, for Americans who are 75 years and older, 54% of women versus 20% of men are widowed. We've labeled this gap, this confidence gap, for those waiting to better understand, who are waiting to make decisions in the hopes that information will come in time to help them make those decisions. This was illustrated in a study by Fidelity, a 2024 study. 32% of women versus 18% of men describe their investing knowledge as non-existent. Women have less time. My wife wanted me to highlight this particular statistic. So women spend 2.34 hours per day on household activities versus 1.67 hours per day from their male counterparts. So they have less time to become well educated on these matters. I think it will come as no, I'm sorry, I skipped one, uneven access to benefits and equity compensation. So a study by Cartas, which is an analysis group, determined that 35% of equity holding employees in private companies are women. But of the total allocation of employee equity, only 20% of it is owned by the 35% who are women. Women have a longer life expectancy. In the US in 2024, it was determined that the average life expectancy for a woman was 81.4 years as opposed to men 76.5. That is a 5-year gap, during which time women are left to manage the affairs of the household. We're going to talk about higher taxes and how it ends up being that the person who most frequently, or the person who survives in the couple, is the one exposed to a higher rate of taxation. We'll come to that illustration in time. But I think the most important slide in this deck is this one, because what you'll see here are these two spheres, the things that matter and the things that we can control. Where they intersect, that's referred to as the zone of control. That's where our energy, time, and focus, if placed there, can produce the best outcomes. This is what we should focus on. We don't need to control everything, just the parts that count. And when we look at the list of things, that we can't control, it is substantial. We can't control the markets or interest rates or inflation. Taxes and the laws that bind us are out of our control. When we have to leave the workforce for whatever demand is placed upon us, we have little control over that. Health events, divorce and widowhood, life transitions. It's a pretty long list. But the list of things we do have control over is as well long. And it includes things like savings and how to automate our savings to make sure it's happening, whether we're focused on it or not. We're not going to talk about all these things today, but where we will place time and attention are on these elements. What are the fundamentals of investment management? Why are costs and fees important? And then we'll talk about this concept, asset location, which and an illustration for how that's an effective way to improve outcomes. All right. So I'm going to say from the start, the goal is not to predict markets. I do not have any special power which allows me to foresee the future, nor does anybody else. We're not trying to predict. We're not trying to time. We'll talk about this concept, market timing, where some hold the view that they can come into and out of the markets at opportune times to either avoid declines or participate more meaningfully in growth moments. The goal is to build a simple process that you can stick with. And these are the 4 pillars of that process: diversification, asset allocation, correlation, and rebalancing. We're going to move through each of these now. Okay, so diversification. If you have any friends that own the company, that have shares of ownership in the company NVIDIA has been a big part of this whole AI craze. They're a company that now occupies a pretty prominent position in the S&P 500, which is just a benchmark we often use to compare our performance to. When it was first introduced to the marketplace, you could buy it for about 25 cents a share. Now it's at $189 per share. To be clear, this presentation is not about what is the next NVIDIA. This presentation, to sum it up in one word, it's about risk. So you could have a substantial allocation to NVIDIA. You could have a small allocation to this particular stock. If it has an outsized position in your portfolio, and we've seen this in the portfolios we analyze, then your fortunes, the performance of your portfolio, will be largely tied to the movement of the company NVIDIA. So if it has that outsized place in your portfolio, or maybe it's the entirety of your stock allocation in your portfolio, then the ups and downs of this particular company will be acutely felt by you. If that risk is something we weren't comfortable with, we could pair NVIDIA with other companies that I'm sure many of you would recognize: Microsoft, Google, Apple, Amazon, Facebook. All of these are companies that are available to us for purchase in the marketplace. And we can add these as we wish to offset the risk of owning one thing and having that thing be too big a part of our portfolio. Now, that's diversification. To be clear, diversification does not insulate you from losses. It's like a seatbelt in a car. So you may still experience the accident, but the damage that you suffer could be greatly minimized by that seatbelt. All right, next topic, asset allocation. So all of these stocks that we've just illustrated, they fall into a particular asset class. We refer to these as growth stocks. Growth stocks are companies that people expect to grow a lot in the future. And as a result, they're willing to pay a higher price for them today. So what you're doing when you buy a growth stock is you're paying for future potential. It's like buying a house in a neighborhood that everyone thinks is about to take off. You're going to pay a slightly higher price for the fact that you think it will grow more quickly in value. But, and importantly, because growth stocks come with high expectations, if these companies fail to meet expectations, growth stocks can fall hard. So we can avail ourselves of a number of different asset classes to offset the risk of being too concentrated in this part of the market. Indeed, we can add value stocks. So if growth stocks are a bet on what a company can become, then value stocks are buying what a company is, potentially at a discount. These companies pay dividends, they're stable companies. We don't expect tremendous volatility in their price. It is typically the case that when growth tends to do better when interest rates are falling and optimism is high, and value tends to hold up better when people care more about cash flow and price. But as you can see, there are other asset classes that can be added to the mix to better diversify away the risks associated with being too concentrated in any one asset class. In fact, this is not an exhaustive list of all the asset classes you could avail yourself of. But again, a great many are available to us and can be added to a diversified portfolio to offset and reduce risk. So one of the things that may stand out about this chart, and it's pretty straightforward. So in any given year, this chart is reflecting the best performing asset classes and the worst, and everything in between. And you can see as the years go by, there are a couple of observations we can make. It is not unusual to see the best performer in the following year be the worst performer. And this can be repeated time and again. You might also note that there is fixed income or bonds in this mix. And there are occasions where they outperform every other asset class. Now, we have a client who hates bonds. Bonds are not exciting. Bonds are boring. I hate them. Bonds function like ballast or shock absorbers. They're there to reduce drawdowns and give you dry powder to rebalance when stocks are on sale. It doesn't shine every year. It's not expected to shine every year. But when equities draw down and substantially, we're going to look to those bonds to give us the stability that we're after. So bonds may feel boring on occasion until the moment where you're glad you have them, in particular in years like 2008. The question always is, how much volatility can we live with and still stay invested? So there have been many academic studies about what distinguishes the performance of one portfolio from another. There was a famous study in the early 2000s. These large pensions, they were examined for the differences in performance from each. And what became obvious to the analysts was it wasn't market timing. The idea that we can come in and out of the market when we think that there's going to be a change to the stocks and bonds that we own. It wasn't market timing. It wasn't security selection, owning Coke instead of Pepsi. What made the difference was the mix of stocks, bonds, and cash that you had in your portfolio at a given time. Asset allocation does not guarantee a specific return. What it does is it narrows the range of outcomes. So if you think about it, a portfolio that has 80% stocks and 20% bonds is going to, over time, likely outperform a portfolio that has 40% stocks and 60% bonds. The only reason you would embrace one over another is if you have an interest in narrowing the range of outcomes. The 80-20 portfolio, 80 stock, 20 bonds, is going to give you higher highs and lower lows. The 40-60 stocks to bonds is going to narrow that range. You'll have lower highs, but you also won't participate as significantly in market declines. Okay, now we'll talk about correlation. So correlation is one that at times trips people up. Uh, Correlation is this idea that if your investments are moving in the same direction always, you probably don't have the diversification you were hoping for. If everything's going up when the market's going up, then it's likely that you don't have this ideal mix of things that are going to move in an opposite direction when other things are going up. So if we can take this line and simply describe it as, call it the S&P 500, call it NVIDIA, call it whatever your stock allocation is, it would be ideal if we could find something that moved in a direction opposite that. Now, again, this is a bit this is for illustrative purposes only. It is not generally the case that we can find something that moves in the exact opposite direction and with the same magnitude as the other thing that we own. But for the sake of this illustration, if we could sell at an opportune time that thing that we own and buy the other thing in our portfolio, which is experiencing stress, and we could do this repeatedly. In other words, we've established a system, a systematic way of identifying those things that are zigging when other things are zagging, sell off the winners, buy those other things which will be productive in time, then we can actually smooth out the volatility in the portfolio. You'll note, if this is indeed our stock portfolio, this blue line, it has outperformed our straight line, our less volatile path. But the less volatile path is likely the one that keeps us invested, and that could make all the difference. That's correlation. Now, closely related to correlation is rebalancing. So let's say I am able to identify the high and low limit of the range of returns that I'm comfortable with, and a portfolio that is 60% stocks and 40% bonds has the highest probability of getting me to my financial goals in time, then maybe this is the portfolio for me. But if we set it and forget it, in time it will drift away from its ideal design. And indeed, in a bull market, when stocks are doing particularly well, the equity portion of our portfolio could grow and often dramatically. If we did nothing at this point and left our portfolio exposed to the volatility of the market, we would feel any decline in the stock market more acutely than we would have if we remained in that 60-40 design. So ideally, we get this opportunity to pare back our equity allocation to the degree that we're back in a range of possibilities that we're more comfortable with. Now, if we employ a system like this, if we have a way to ensure that this is being done, irrespective of what our emotions around investing are, what we'll see over time, these are called Callan charts. And again, it's just reflective of what the best performing asset class versus the worst performing asset class was in a given year. So what we're seeing is this well-diversified portfolio that's taking advantage of all these asset classes. We're seeing where it falls in this mix, best to worst. And as one would expect, because it is a mix of everything else on this chart, it is never at the top, it is never at the bottom. It bumps along kind of in this mid-range as we move through time. What's most impressive to me about this chart is not that the asset allocated portfolio is the top 4 performer over a 14-year period. What's most impressive to me is it achieves that standing. At the same time, this last column measures volatility. At the same time, it has almost the lowest volatility of any of these options. When we can look back in time and see that our portfolio has performed in this way, we know we've achieved our aim of growth at a reasonable pace, growth without too much volatility, growth which is sufficient to get us to our financial goals. I always like to use metaphors. I can tell you that farmers are among the best risk managers, and that's really what we're talking about, risk management and all this. They're among the best risk managers out there. A farmer can't control the weather any more than anybody else can. What they can do is plant two different crops. Cauliflower grows in wet conditions. Pumpkins, dry, arid conditions. If the farmer plants both, no matter what the weather brings, she'll have something to sell at the farm stand on that future date when they harvest the crops. All right, I'm going to pivot now to a topic that gave me um, quite a bit of challenge when I first started to learn about investing. The different options that I have to put money into. So I'm going to focus on the equity markets for now. Most people understand what a stock is. It's ownership in a company. I could go out today and buy a share of Google. It will cost me $300 per share. It doesn't take a math genius to figure out that if I'm buying one share of Google, everything I talked about to this point about building a well-diversified portfolio, about different asset classes, kind of gets thrown out the window because I have to invest so much just to own one share of these things, of this particular stock. I could pool my money with the money that other people would put into what a pooled investment referred to as a mutual fund. So my dollars get added to somebody else's dollars, get added to somebody else's dollars. Then we can go out and purchase fractional shares of these stocks. The promise of the mutual fund manager then is if you do this, if you give me these dollars, I will charge you a fee. That fee is for accessibility, right? The pooled investment product. And I can outperform the benchmark to which I will be compared. Now, every one of these investments has a benchmark. We know, we often refer to the S&P 500, which is probably the best known benchmark. So these are all large growth companies, and you can compare them to a benchmark to determine how that manager is doing for you. The manager will charge you, in the case of large growth stocks, they'll charge you between 55 basis points or 0.55% all the way up to 1.5%. The concern I have about this is, at least in this space, most managers, 80 to 90% of them, over long periods of time, underperform their benchmarks. So yes, I want a pooled investment option, but paying somebody to manage these my dollars when they're clearly not performing frequently enough to warrant it, that's a bit troubling. So in the 90s, another pooled investment product came along. It was referred to as an exchange traded fund, or ETF. The cost for these pooled investment strategies was dramatically lower than mutual funds. Consequently, you got access to the benchmark because that's all these ETFs represent, are the benchmarks that they're tracking. The promise is not to outperform. The promise is simply that you'll have access to that category of investments. And you can get it for 14 times when I compare it to that option in the mutual fund space charging me 0.55%, 14 times less for the same access. All right. Anybody that's attended one of these sessions before knows we talk a lot about taxes. We talk a lot about taxes because taxes are incredibly important when it comes to growing wealth. These are the marginal tax brackets for 2026. What this means is, I'll explain the three columns. I have a marginal rate of taxation. This is the rate I will be taxed for the last dollar that falls into this range. If I'm filing individually, it's these ranges. If I'm filing as a married couple, it's these ranges. What stands out about this, and getting back to the point made earlier about taxes and how they impact the survivor in a couple, who again is most frequently the female spouse. If I'm receiving income from all sources, Social Security, um, pensions, perhaps annuities, maybe even RMDs at this point, required minimum distributions from tax deferred accounts. My income could be, the household income could be $211,400 from all sources. Those dollars, the ones that fall into this range, are taxed at 22%. If my spouse predeceases me, I will then file as an individual. When I do, that 211,000 falls in a different range in this spectrum, and I'll be taxed 32 cents on every dollar that falls in that bracket. This is often referred to as the widow's tax. So now we're going to finish our conversation talking about ways to hopefully avoid this. One of my favorite ways is to talk about Roth conversions. We're not going to do that today, but we have lots of videos out there that talk about that. So, and I'm happy to answer questions if you have interest in that. But one of the things I do want to talk about are the three buckets for investments that everybody has. You have an after-tax bucket, a pre-tax bucket, and a tax-free bucket. We have other labels to describe these things. Brokerage, traditional 401k, traditional IRA, Roth 401k, IRA. My favorite bucket is the tax-free bucket. Second, or second to that is the after-tax bucket, and it has everything to do with the way these things are taxed. So imagine buying that NVIDIA share or that Google share, and it goes from $1 to $10. That's $9 worth of growth. If I hold that position and sell after a year, then I will pay a long-term capital gains tax. In some cases, I can pay zero tax based on my income, zero tax when I go to sell that. Otherwise, I'll pay 15 or as high as 20. When monies are removed from the pre-tax bucket, you are taxed at ordinary income rates. There are 7 of those. And you can see the more money you make, the higher the taxation, all the way up to 37. So if I have a choice between taking dollars out of this bucket or this bucket, and I'm in the 37% tax bracket, I'm likely going to want to take from this bucket, if I even have the opportunity to do so. And then the final bucket, tax-free, again, my favorite bucket. Within this, with a collection of tax-free accounts, the HSA is far superior, but I won't get off topic talking about that. The other thing to be aware of in all of this is what happens at death. So these buckets will be inherited by the next generation. From the after-tax bucket, I will either be receiving, if I inherit something from a well-meaning relative, a step up in basis. I'll talk about what that means a little bit in a second. If I'm taking dollars from an inherited traditional IRA, those dollars are fully taxable to me in this range of taxation. Less ideal than this other option, the brokerage account inheritance. And then finally, the tax-free account, if I inherit something from that bucket, it is tax-free to me as well, which is fantastic. So let me come back real quick to this step up in basis issue. So when I inherit something from a brokerage account, let's assume in this case we've got Sarah and her aunt Margaret, or maybe it's her mother. Margaret buys a 1,000 of XYZ stock at $100 a share. Over time, the value of each share goes up from $100 to $300. Now the value of Margaret's holdings are $400,000. That's a $300,000 unrealized gain. Margaret could sell the position and expose herself to capital gains, either 0, 15, or 20%. If, however, Margaret passes still owning that position, then that position gets a step up in basis. It goes from the cost basis, which was 100 when Margaret paid that for the share, all the way up to $400 a share. Sarah, the person who inherits the position, could sell it the next day at zero tax. That's a step up in cost basis. All right, last topic for today's conversation. I'm a little bit over, so I'll go quickly. Where we put our assets has a meaningful difference in terms of outcomes. If you think about those buckets again, taxable, tax deferred, tax free, very frequently I'll look at portfolios from people that ask us to review their portfolio and see that the same arrangement is found in each portfolio. In other words, coming back to that 60-40 design, that's the design I want. So I'm just going to put that in all three types of accounts. And you can do that. But one could also elect to push the riskier parts of the portfolio, the stocks, into the two buckets where they have the greatest tax advantage. In other words, I could push my stocks into the taxable account and ideally into the tax-free account. If I do that, I achieve this aim of getting growth in a tax-advantaged way into the two buckets where I'll benefit from that. If I look at this tax-deferred bucket, a couple of things are happening there. That's where all my bonds are. Consequently, the balances are likely to grow less quickly in this account, which means as well that when RMDs, required minimum distributions, are forced out of the account into the household, those amounts will be less. If I get this right, and over time I can achieve this aim, I've still got a 60-40 design. I've still got the desirable risk characteristics of something that has 60% stocks and 40% bonds. I've just allocated it differently based on these buckets. If I get it right, in the end, perhaps all of my growth or a substantial amount of it has happened in my brokerage account and in my Roth for the tax advantage distributions that come to the people who would inherit my wealth, mine and my wife's wealth. And this bucket, which is smaller for the fact that that's where the distributions were coming from that perhaps funded lifestyle expenses, that bucket's smaller. And that's going to have a advantageous impact on income coming into the household of the people who inherited these assets. So I went a little over, but I just want to cover quickly, which is fine because my voice is failing me anyways, key takeaways. If there's one message I hope to leave you with, it's that you don't have to predict the markets to build wealth. You need a process. Control the controllables. Here are the steps. Diversify so that one event doesn't derail you. Allocate across asset classes in such a way, create a target allocation that matches your needs and the goals that you and your family have. Rebalance over time. Use low-cost vehicles where prudent. And then make sure, to the extent possible, you're locating assets, particular types of assets, growth assets, in the most advantageous way across those three buckets. Finally, because I keep getting this question time and again, it's never too late to start. It's never too late to start this. There are ways to educate yourself on these matters. We are happy to help in any way we can, but it's never too late to start. I want to thank you all for your time and attention. Again, apologies for the state of my voice. Hopefully you found this helpful. Again, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us.